This evening, Rinpoche continued his discussion on the stage of the path shared in common with beings of medium capacity that Lama Tsongkhapa summarizes in the stanza that reads the following: "Bless me to perceive all that's wrong with the seemingly good things of this life. I can never get enough of them. They cannot be trusted. They are the door to every pain I have. Grant me then to strive instead for the happiness of freedom." So this book, The Essence of Eloquence by Lama Tsongkhapa, is a very important book, a very, Buddha Chenmo is like a very solid work, because it's very solid work because we find that the first position that Lama Tsongkhapa presents is the position of a Sangha in the mind-only school, and then we find the presentation of the Madhyamaka view, the middle way view, according to such masters as Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, Chandrakirti, Chandrarashita. So it's a very important work that elucidates the meaning of these schools. The tambo? Then a Ganchin Gepe Sochen Tsongkhapa. So when we speak of Nagarjuna and we speak of a Sangha, we say that they are the trailblazers or the chariot blazers of their traditions, a Sangha being the mind-only trailblazer and Nagarjuna being the trailblazer of the Madhyamaka. And here, when we look at Lama Tsongkhapa's mantra, it says Tsongkhapa, crown jewel of the sages of the land of snows. Here, this is really saying the trailblazer, the crown jewel, the trailblazer, Lama Tsongkhapa, of the land of the snows. And this is referring to blazing the trails. What trails did he blaze? He blazed those trails that Asanga and Nagarjuna blazed, and this is why we would call Tsongkhapa in Tibet a trailblazer as well, because he gave those presentations and opened up. They call it also the opener of the chariot way. So it's translated so many different ways, but it's a trailblazer, opening of the chariot way. And what that means, as a translator's note, it opens the path for the chariot to go through, for you to be able to understand the points that are made in the mind only, understand the points made in the Madhyamaka. So that's why it's called the opening, the trail to the chariot way, or trailblazer. Okay. So before Lama Tsongkhapa came, there were many great scholars in Tibet, but we don't really find any work that elucidates these points like The Essence of Eloquence by Lama Tsongkhapa to that date. I'm sorry, I've missed one part. So then when we look at blazing trails, there are two categories: blazing the trail of the sutra and blazing the trail of the tantra. So the sutra trailblazer, we would say, was what was just explained, those tenets of Asanga and Nagarjuna. And then when we look at trailblazing in terms of the Tantrayana, or opening the chariot way of the Tantrayana, we find the Guhya Samaja completion stage practices that are presented by Lama Tsongkhapa.
the Gaji Suji Zoba, the Takante, Leshi Nibu and Deba, Tai Ishatul May, Jerematu, Veidul Leshi Nibin Deba Moyer commentary.
And then this Essence of Eloquence by Lama Tsongkhapa has so many commentaries written about it.
What the Leshi Nibin Deba, the Leshi Nibu, the Dagina in a good Kabu, the Negachiburis.
Although it's a very difficult text, it's of utmost importance.
Bless So now we will move on to the text that we've been going over, Lama Tsongkhapa's Source of All My Good. And when we look at the different bodies of work that Lama Tsongkhapa has, in the Lamrim tradition, or the Stage of the Path tradition, which we find to be commentaries on Atisha's Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment, there are various sizes of texts that Lama Tsongkhapa wrote to explain the stages of the path. So the greatest the greatest work with the most amount of information pertaining to the stages of the path is the great treatise on the stage of the path to enlightenment. And then the next size work, we find the medium stages of the path to enlightenment that Lama Tsongkhapa wrote, which is a little bit smaller than the great treatise on the stage of the path to enlightenment. And then next down, we find the text called the Lamrim Dudan, the abbreviated stages of the path to enlightenment. And then an even smaller text is this one, the Source of All My Good, sometimes translated the Foundation of All Good Qualities. So this is the most condensed, summarized explanation of the stages of the path. So, if everyone wants to turn to page 39, in English we have the Source of All My Good. So we're going to start here, JP Mingum. So bless me to perceive all. So we move about 5 stanzas in, I think, 3, 4, 5. 5 stanzas in, and we find, bless me to perceive all that's wrong with the seemingly good things of this life. I can never get enough of them. They cannot be trusted. They are the door to every pain I have. Grant me then to strive instead for the happiness of freedom. So here we find the presentation of renunciation, the determination to be free, the desire to definitely emerge. And that desire to definitely emerge can be found in all of the stages of the path for the different capacities. They are just specific to that specific scope or capacity. So we find that there is a renunciation that is shared in common with beings of small capacity, renunciation that is shared in common with beings of medium capacity, and then we have a renunciation that is specific to beings of great capacity. So renunciation is something that we can find and can present according to those different capacities, and they are are considered in common at the small and medium scope. But when we read this specific excerpt from Lama Tsongkhapa's Source of All My Good, this is pertaining to the happiness of freedom, of liberation, of being liberated from cyclic existence. So the desire to emerge in this case is to emerge from samsara, from cyclic existence.
Pabonka Lamrim, what the Catu TV more than Kunju, Monosi, Yamil and Tabidawala, Tony Chepacho, Shijalo.
Is anybody
She's on what the tea turned out there, the chewing on Twitter, Nanso to Nansanshi, John Rutan Lady, and Landu Treason baby. Nego want to have me 10 ans. Ne penju pensu toba le ni zang toba simes hote ta jibu chung de zhou de chung de tong la ngai zhou sang ba chung ngai zhou sang ba chung de tong ngai zhou sang ba de wo de ten de duo ta ku de wa ne che zang ku de wa le gazi je ba ina moi yo mares jebe mongos 가지 배제제와이나 그 대화를 어느 코와든 대화는 천루자그래 대사 천루자그래스 제자 롱시베 몽오바스 제비 몽오스야 된바래 다도 잡아 화벌 페드 대사들 천루그래스 네 동에 맞아봐 도만대봐 어디는 그 대사 시점도 들라테네 동에 뭐 제가 주시그래스 Shebes, then doing Kuju to grow to buy agents. What that doing the Kuju when I call could Sango mother and
Jao again doing Lapa?
When the San Sudan. What did that Janga belongs down? That's a Janga. Janga Chambers, what the Lari, because Jambe Chemo on the Vedro.
Ah, like Jambel Shelong. Okay.
To me, 2 minutes in the Ransan, 2 kg in the army by ye. Trunimo, the go 10 base. Toma Maban Tatibaton as in the Shak Hondo to Masu Sen on Yandu Yores. What the Zukno Naso what the Sultan du Vares, the Sultan by the 10 bay, what the Sultan de Ta, Medusin to the Kuja du Vares, Medusin to the quality of letter, and the Toma Maban Tatibato, Masu Conde and the Shak Condola Suba, the young lady to the Wonki, and then Masu call Kudiad, Geshe Vares. Lemon de Lungi Rajin, lemon de Lungi Le. Tanyo mu ke lojile ngagile ne hijile what the sun what is a leg to galuna but it's long rojine donner son ji ballon d'os ta donner ju de chaba de ji donner que jasu na lo what the no yores tuiten do chematar ko gamatar ko tuiten gamatar ko Gamas and water, Masu magic and Majipana, those Kolajana, Kolona,
Lesser.
What we thought of doing Jew, doing Kolajana, what the Gama Kolona Brace.
Okay.
Takas are Ballon to Twitter to Yamu, maybe the Tinted.
The Nyomo, the Da Nyone, that's a Ja Yone. Not Garida.
Long Rajine, the Mason Ballon to Twitter and Comentary Coas, Qualis Kuderes.
Lesser.
The Sanji, Yamu, Tami does. This the Sanjina, Yamu Tami does. Till Santa Vaina, what they Daniel Mugu, 제벌에 들어서 말해 지당 가서 달라 실로는 가서 자세 대야죠.
Lesa.
다른 가서 자에 주도 가서래 녀무도 가서 자리죠. 다 다도 녀무도 가서 자리죠. 예수는 자 중바세한테 녀무가 자 중발로 와르스.
Lesa.
녀무 담이 자 선대나 자시 세발라스 선대에는
Lesa.
수술 내바지가 다는 세바야
Yadandra.
아니 어때 못에 파워에서 라그로와스
Lesa.
어때 다녀 못세 도바이나 파워 텔레라베 파워레스 어때 손대로 파워 롱셰나스 뒤대지 자우 녀몬데 잔디 hyla 법 hyla 보스 셰송 바타르 코안데 더가 타진 좀 자와네 랑기 제버셰 랑기 제버셰데 헤유수 주비 녀모가 잔데니 라스 다가다 어떻게
Ni.
지금 그들 손대자 말이야.
So when we look at this particular stanza that says, "Bless me to perceive all that's wrong with the seemingly good things of this life. I can never get enough of them. They cannot be trusted. They are the door to every pain I have. Grant me then to strive instead for the happiness of freedom." We can look to Pabonka Rinpoche's commentary and find that it's explained quite well. It says, suppose we are, so I'm going to give the commentary as Rinpoche did as I read through this. So suppose we are able to follow all the instructions above. We contemplate how death works and think on the suffering of the lower realms. Then we make all the effort we are supposed to in going for refuge and observing the laws of deeds and their consequences. Admittedly, then we could manage once or twice to reach one of the better forms of life as a pleasure being or human, and also acquire some incredible amount of wealth, at least for the time being. So here we find this desire to definitely emerge that's shared in common with beings of small capacity. So we find these points that are made here about the contemplating the suffering of the lower realms and refuge and karma and its results that were presented in this small capacity instruction. So here Pabonka has first presented that and said that now that you have contemplated this, now look to contemplate, then now that you have contemplated this and understood this, look further into the actual nature of suffering. So then it says, but the nature of all pleasant things in the circle of life is that no matter how much we get and how much we enjoy it, what we get, we never feel as though we've had enough. No matter how much we acquire, how many material things, how many of the things that we desire we actually have, are able to acquire, no matter how much we get, they all become a source of suffering for us because they are within cyclic existence. So we become attached to these things, and in dependence upon our attachment, we have a great amount of suffering when these things that we became attached to turn into a form of suffering for us. So that's what is meant here. And we are insatiable in that because of our attachment, we never feel that we have enough of enough things. We're never satisfied with what we have. So as a result, this insatiability causes us suffering. It only makes us want more, it only increases our desire. And this then delivers to us a whole variety of unbearable pain. The pleasant things turn around and become the door to every pain I have. So the things that we grasp at, become attached to, that we feel will bring us a state of happiness, actually transform into a state of suffering. So they're actually, by acquiring them, we are entering the door into our future suffering. So this is what is meant by that. And then cyclic existence it continues because of this attachment that we have. And then we find a quote from the great fifth Dalai Lama's work, The Spoken Words of Manjushri. So it says, it's written in like a question and answer way. So it says, what happened before? Someone has been in my mind for time with no beginning. So what this means is, since beginningless time, we have had a mental continuum that has been plagued with suffering. So there has been someone who's been creating activity, meaning, as a translator's note, whoever is the basis in each life. And so that someone is the whatever basis it is, a human, animal, etc. So since beginningless time, this basis of the mental continuum has been housed by various beings. And it says, when was that? There has never been a moment when they were gone. So what has happened before? Someone has been in my mind for no time with no beginning. When was that? There's never been a moment when they were gone. So this mental continuum, since beginningless time, has always been, and there's always been someone, if you will, this is very loose, calling inhabiting it. There's been someone who's been that eye of that mental continuum always, at all times. Who are they? I live and live again. The mental afflictions. So it's the mental afflictions that actually drive this circle of existence. So in dependence, for instance, in dependence upon attachment, in dependence upon anger, we then create karma through our body, speech, and mind. So as a result of that action, or that karma that we create, influenced by those negativities, we suffer in the future. So I live again and again the mental afflictions. The mental afflictions are what produce this again and again. And in the end, they will leave me to rot in the ocean of suffering life without an end in sight. So this will not end. These afflictions will always create this type of suffering, and they will never create anything but that. So this will be a circle that will continue, and it says we'll have to be rot in this, meaning that we will constantly be plagued by this suffering if we have mental afflictions. It says, and the karma, it comes like the wind with all the things I never wanted. So we create actions through our body, speech, and mind, and then as a result, we suffer. Even though we don't want to, we don't desire suffering, our karma and afflictions produce that experience of suffering because of the negative, because of the non-virtuous aspect of them. And it says, how far? It whips around me everywhere and stirs the great waves, the three forms of suffering. Where does this reach to? These afflictions reach to the point that one has to have the suffering, have the suffering of change, have pervasive compounded suffering. So these are the three types of suffering that, in dependence upon the poisons of the attachment, hatred, and ignorance, arise. And how long? I could wander around this sea forever. The torch would spin and the circle of light would blaze. So if you were to take a fire and spin it around in circles, it would appear that there was a continuous circle there, that it wasn't just one light. It would appear that there was a circle that was created by this circular motion. And likewise, this circle of life is created within the cyclic existence, which is plagued with suffering by our afflictions. And will always be created, and we will always have the suffering of change, the suffering of suffering, and pervasive compounded suffering if we have those present. So our future lives will be sure to have those forms of suffering. What should I see? Think on this and see the afflictions of the mind are the one true enemy. So we look at all beings outside of ourselves and label them as our enemy, but the real enemy is within us, is the afflictions that are within us that guide these actions, that cause us to suffer. The external enemy does not. And what must be done? The enemy of living for this life must die. So here this is saying that living for the things of this life, desiring the things of this life, not looking towards future lives, wishing to emerge at the varying levels, is a downfall, is an enemy. So living for just this life is our enemy, just as the afflictions are our enemy. And it says, what should I do? You have to pretend you are a warrior enough to be the one. So here, this is referring to a warrior who could destroy the afflictions. So this is saying that when we look at what a foe destroyer is, an arhat is the Sanskrit word for foe destroyer. The foe here is the afflictions. So it's one who has destroyed the afflictions. So this is what an arhat is, a foe destroyer. So it says you have to be a warrior enough. You will have to pretend that you are the warrior enough to be the one. So you have to engage in these practices and try to combat and destroy these afflictions as the foe destroyers have done, as the enemy destroyers, arhats, have done. So you have to pretend to be the one, an enemy destroyer, because of what you see these afflictions do. When will it come? Your foes, the afflictions in your mind, have always been there waiting, ready for battle. So when will it come? Anytime you are ready. And now then, the time has surely come. Go forth now and defeat them. Then Lama Tsongkhapa goes on, Pabonka Rinpoche goes on and says, as the lines point out, there is one thing which acts as the very root of all our suffering here in the circle of life. This is none other than the enemy of the mental afflictions, so dearly cherished by us, so close to our hearts. And I think that's where Rinpoche stopped. Rinpoche.
Oh, yeah.
The Shera Ninja Budu,
Yeah.
Selbudu.
What Dangato the Katulma, Larish of Vijana, Neja Juji Gungo, Chinya Battledua, Dunga Gubakuma, Sawatanma, Susan Marga, Dunga Gubakuma, ancient Kulten.
Okay, so now we're going to move to the great treatise on the stage of the path to enlightenment. And we'll be on page right around 270, 271. Chitan Chedak. Chitan Chedak. Okay, so page 271.
Kuachi Dunga Sabata, Susu Dunga Sabata, Lari Chibutan, do you know what the Sukatan do was?
So when we look to the source of all my good, the foundation of all good qualities, and we read this section, this stanza that deals with this, it is merely a summary or an abbreviation of all the contents of this section of the Lamrim Chenmo, the great treatise on the stage of the path to enlightenment. So within that stanza, implicitly all this information is in there.
What did that Dunga Gumbango de la Ni Kuashi, Dunga Sambata, Susu Dunga Sabati, She Dunga Sambata, Dunga J. True, Sun Marva, Susu Dunga Sambata, Dory to Susu Dunga Samba. What does the Gangu?
So in the outline, we find the main heading, the actual meditation on suffering, and then it says that there are two divisions. First, reflection on the universal suffering of cyclic existence, or the general sufferings of cyclic existence, and then reflection on specific sufferings. And then under the category of reflection on the universal suffering of cyclic existence, it says this is divided into three. Reflection on the 8 types of suffering, reflection on the 6 types of suffering, and then meditation on the 3 types of suffering. So we find those points explained. And then reflection on the specific sufferings deals with the specific sufferings of the individual beings. So this is what is meant by the specific sufferings, sufferings that are specific to individuals. So these are the points that are made, which then again are the expanded explanation of that stanza.
Tanganjung Samba, what the Dunga and Abanjun Samba Gurota, Dunga Nabanjuja, Dunga la Kanaka, Kuashi Dunga, Sana, Kuashi Dunga and Abanju, Sudan, Kwa susu dunga sana, kwa susu le ngaba yuchu, dunga le ngaba yuchu, ni yonguru marba.
So, when we speak of the desire to definitely emerge from suffering, what are we trying to emerge from, or definitely emerge from? We are trying to emerge from the general sufferings of cyclic existence and trying to emerge from the specific sufferings of cyclic existence. So these are the two things that we are trying to emerge from, or that we are renouncing.
What that doing jit what the Pabonka so then Lani Cheman mat cheating long Jana, most of them Bajita, Sudi Dubajit Jishadua. Then as Lani Sajin down in all the two Dubdua are Sajin, doing a jet the truth of song to save Dua, doing a jet or doing a jet, and then Sajin what the G doing a guy doing a night doing a chi doing a Maduba the Trebi doing a Duba the trade doing a Duba Cheto, Maneba doing a Dunayana Pabonka, doing over the Jit Marba, who took to Saji, you know what the Saji Duldan should was.
So then, looking at the first category, reflection on the universal suffering of cyclic existence, their first category is reflection on the 8 types of suffering. So we have a quote from Nagarjuna's friendly letter, or letter to a friend there, where we have those 8 sufferings presented, but those 8 sufferings are presented by way of explicit statements as well as intended by words, or those that are intended by words. So it's difficult to find all of those 8, or to understand what those 8 are. But if we look at the actual outline of the Great Treatise on the Stage of the Path to Enlightenment, it's quite easy to understand those 8 because they're just listed. So we have the suffering of birth, the suffering of old age, the suffering of sickness or illness, the suffering of death, the suffering of encountering what is unpleasant, the suffering of separation from what is pleasant, the suffering of not getting what you want, and then the suffering of the 5 appropriated aggregates. So these are the 8 types of suffering just listed by looking at the main outline.
What the Gandu Santana, what the Gandu Guachayuna, and what is the Kabuyo Maro, Magayu, Tele Tag Deba, what the Naju somebody so.
So you look at these 8 types of suffering and recognize that if you're within cyclic existence, because of being in cyclic existence, you have these types of suffering, and then you begin to wish to be separated from these types of suffering, and then you wish to definitely emerge from them, and this is how the contemplating them transforms into renunciation.
What do I get? What do I get? What the John Debudua?
Dead School Rinpoche. Did we lose power? Should we wait? Dead School Rinpoche. We're good? Dixon.
What did that know what the I don't get John Shebachilo Lab, John Shebachin, Richmond, Jitter, and Nanga, what the Leon would do, and the put up again.
So then each of these types of the 8 suffering are explained very, very well in the Great Treatise on the Stage of the Path to Enlightenment. And we find that there are 5 points made about each of these 8 types of suffering, or 5, I guess points, that's the best way to explain it, 5 sections, or 5 categories of points that are made about each of these 8. So Lama Tsongkhapa explains it quite well.
That what doing it, true somebody doing never maybe doing it, never maybe doing it. Never maybe doing it in a quality, what the Jadan yelling about your mothers, Jadan yelling about your mothers. Machin ye to so, and Germany down, Japan to Amara Jamar.
Less
That is somewhat the true marble. Jadan yelling about Mudu.
Less
Then I Jadan yelling about my boss.
Less
Jadan yelling about my bar. And then Yagata dueling about my bar. what the Mama Kuya Yojiro, the Neba Mebas,
Nama the Chipa.
Chiba,
Pabonka.
Tene Moba maybe doing us, Moba maybe doing it, Marvetanga, so Kalanis said now, what the Kalashimut, what the Tanga, this or Tasagme, Sayo Marota, the Yaja Mor Sag, Double Hill Marve, Moba maybe doing it. Zula Tai Doa, and Zul Tai Doal Moba Meba, Dry Yabi Doal Moba Meba, Da. Ane Chenmo, Dawala Ngaba Meba, Ronu Dawala Ngaba Meba, Rejanu Dawala Ngaba Meba, to see Jerwada.
We got the Nipa.
Moba Meba. Moba Meba, so Moba Meba doing it.
The Kala, the Moa Go. Then they Ro, Reja, the Kanga Yuribe.
Hotel Momulja.
Okay, Ro, Reja.
Zu da te ro Reja. What the Zula Tai Dua, the Walungoba Meba, Janyabi the Walungoba Meba, what the Kangalja Zero.
Okay. Lessa.
Then Louis Anna had to do Doas.
Lessa.
I don't call it just a dule, Lanson Shemar, in Lanson Shagre, Yanji, Yan Lundo, Yan doing nearby you are donating Bare.
Lessa.
Louis Anna, Yatan Doas, do you do game Bare? Yan in San Joa, Yan quality. And Dendrol Jewa Denegazua Marta, Dajum Matubato.
Lessa.
Tenayana tomato was tomato. I'm Chanson Hal Chigre, Chanson Bal Chigre, Chanson Jawal Chigre, Chanson Dendrol Chigre, what in Ebayo Maris, tomato Joas.
Lessa.
What is Damaral Jaro? And then true maybe a bus. True me about what a Tambi Chuju, what the Raya Kabi that true maybe never. What the true the red war, doing a true somebody.
Lessa. So then when we look at the 6 types of suffering, we begin with the fault of uncertainty. This means that our friends and our enemies are really uncertain. So one point about this uncertainty would be our friends and our enemies. So for instance, our friends become our enemies and our enemies become our friends. Look at Japan and Germany, for instance. They were both our enemies, but now have become our friends. I can take her. So we see that there is no constant relationship there. There's this uncertainty that's related to it. Then we have the fault of insatiability. It means that we're never satisfied. We can eat something that's very good, but then we'll want something else. We're not satisfied with just that. And then we have this insatiability that's related to our sounds we don't find we have enough of, or our tastes, or our smells, or tactile sensations, or forms that we find attractive that we can't get enough of. So all of these fall categorically under the fault of insatiability. So we want them again and again, and we can never have enough of them and be satisfied with what we get when we get it. Next is the fault of casting off bodies. If we're in cyclic existence, we die again and again and again. And each time we do that, we cast off a body. We cast off what our mental consciousness was abiding in. So there's this constant shucking of bodies off that takes place. The fault of repeated rebirth, that we keep again and again having birth within cyclic existence. So we shuck these bodies off, and then we are forced to be born again, and forced to be born again, and forced to be born again. The fault of repeatedly descending from high to low. So we could be born in the God's realm and then have to go to the lower realms of cyclic existence and then become a human and then again to the gods. So we could see how we are constantly moving from the high realms to the lower realms and back to the high realms. And then the fault of having no companions is that it's very difficult for us in a lifetime to have a Dharma friend, to have a true companion, to have someone, the Rinpoche said, a true companion, a Dharma friend. And this isn't something that we acquire very often. So this is what is meant by the fault of having no companions. It means the rarity of having Dharma friends.
어제 다 동에 송상 받는데 도 송상 봐 동에지 동에서 동에지 동에서 왔던 가서 소알 동에 러거래 소아 동에지 동에 안에 소아 동에 있는 동에 차 동에지 동에 있는 소아 동에 차서 넣는데 그래 동에지 동에 주의 동에서 왔던 가서 도와진도 kuyu dowa 어때 사지지 도와들 주의 도와 주의 도와 주의 동에서 어때 말해
Lesson.
되네
Chabaduje.
되는 차반 뒤지 동에로 차반 뒤지 동에 어때 차반 뒤지 동에 다 동에지 동에 차반 뒤지 동에를 잡아가려 해서나 배지 무슨 되고도 동에 있는 차반 뒤지 동에 미쳐
Yeah.
차반 뒤지 동에 있는 동에 맞아
Show.
아니 도와 주질런 데 말아
Dewa. Ale. Dewa. Ju doing
주의
your chair.
주의 동에
Lesso.
무슨 데가 도와
Lesso.
되네 주의 동에 다 차반 뒤지 동에 무슨 이지로다 주의 동에는 차반 뒤지 동에 미쳐
Yeah, Musa.
차반 뒤지 동에는 주의 동에 맞아 동에지
Sorry,
동에
doing out Chuchen.
동에지 동에 주시스 그래서 도와 아니 얘가 하면 자식으로다 도와도 차반 뒤지 동에
Abbot.
어디서 간 갈래 산다는 어디
Lesso.
놓고 어디 야번 게들다
Lesso. Then the Chabaduje and doing out the Donagare, the Lamason.
차반 뒤지 동에서 지단 자시지나 아니 코아 코서도 뇌바 조면서 말이야
Lesso.
탄질을 쳐비 등에들 차반 뒤지 등에서 어지러다 자시르마도 차반 뒤지 등에나 탄질을 쳐비 차반 뒤지 말보다
Lesso.
다 kuyu 등에 지단 kuyu 등에 자리고
Lesso. So then we have the three types of suffering. So the first type of the three is the suffering of suffering. So this, if it is a suffering of suffering, it is necessarily a suffering feeling. So this is what is meant by the suffering of suffering, a feeling of suffering. Then we have the suffering of change. The suffering of change is referring to contaminated happiness, to the happiness of cyclic existence. So this is the suffering of change. And pervasive compounded suffering refers to being forced or always being born again and again into the three realms of cyclic existence, of the desire realm, the form realm, and the formless realm. So this is the pervasive compounded suffering, is being forced into these aggregates or into these aggregates in these various realms. So we can look at these in we could look at them and compare these according to how many possibilities or permutations there are. So we could say, if we compare the suffering of suffering and pervasive compounded suffering, how many possibilities are there? Are there 4 possibilities, 3 possibilities, mutually exclusive, or synonymous? So when we look to those two topics, we would find that there are 3 possibilities, because if it is the suffering of suffering, it is pervasive compounded suffering, because it's the suffering of cyclic existence. But if it is pervasive compounded suffering, it is not necessarily the suffering of suffering. So if you were to say, posit that which is pervasive compounded suffering, but not the suffering of suffering, one could say the subject happiness of cyclic existence. The suffering happiness of cyclic existence is not the suffering of suffering, but it is pervasive compounded suffering. And then we could compare pervasive compounded suffering and the suffering of change, and we could say the suffering of change is necessarily the suffering of cyclic existence, but the suffering of the suffering of change is necessarily pervasive compounded suffering, but pervasive compounded suffering is not necessarily the suffering of change. And then if you said posit that which is pervasive compounded suffering but not the suffering of change, you could say the suffering of suffering, the suffering of suffering. That would be something which is pervasive compounded but not the suffering of change. And then something which is both, which is a common locus, is very easy to understand. Something which is both in either case. the suffering of change and the suffering, pervasive compounded suffering, you could just say happiness. Or the suffering of suffering and pervasive compounded suffering, you could say the suffering feeling. And then something which is neither is very easy. So when you begin to look at these topics and can analyze them in that way, you learn what they mean in a much more thorough fashion. So when you can compare phenomena in that way. So we'll take a short break. And I'm going to go walk.
What is looking a lot of Lamrim and Sibudua, Susu Dunga Sambala to Niwa da to do Hamai, the high Dunga Sambos, what the Chodua.
So then when we get into reflection on the specific types of suffering, we find the 6 different realms presented and the specific sufferings that those individuals within those realms have to endure. So we find the suffering of the human beings, the suffering of the demigods, reflection on the suffering of the deities, and then this Rinpoche, the Drukare. Okay. Okay.
And then Lama Imara.
Less so. Okay. So then we find also the other 3 beings that suffer. So we're moving outside the outline. So we find the specific sufferings pertain to the beings in the 6 realms of cyclic existence. So the suffering that the hell realms endure, the suffering that the hungry ghosts endure, the suffering that the animals endure, the suffering that the gods endure, the suffering that the demigods endure, the suffering that the humans endure. So here we find the specific sufferings that these individuals have to experience presented here.
Tani dunga chaba du dunga chaba kariyo na masonra ingrota ni dunga chaba du dunga chab
Ni dunga sena
nyawa hell.
Oh, nyawa agomchi. Okay. So if we look at the 2 categories, the suffering of the hell realm and pervasive compounded suffering, musum, we find that there are 3 permutations, 3 possibilities. And all 6 of those we'll find that there are 3 permutations or 3 possibilities. And if we think about this, we'll come to a very good understanding that we won't forget. If we think in this way, by comparison and so forth.
Dunga gomba ngola ni kwashi dunga samba tang susu dunga samba was what ni dansa ro ta tombala son dunga what tombala son sa what dunga ji samba to samba son samba sa ro ta dana jelma je what ma shiding lo dana dunga ji dra marba Shidin les debe pontan chewadan nadan gasu dunga tomayi june koala ne jundejin shesomba tar samba osa ta shidin le naban debe pontan debe ngoba te jamanye dunga tre naban debe pontan Tene chi dunga, nai dunga, gai dunga.
That's so.
Gai dunga, de je wata zu ngode je wata. Ta suri duba tele, suri duba je rota kar. Suri duba je. Ana wate.
Je dunga.
she somba ter gomba os tela koashi dengan gomba ne tela donge tomai jone samba os ta koashi dengan gonsa de koashi dengan donge jone ba donge jone ba san lo yang ne ta donge to so je ba la ten tela ten donge ngoro ta donge gabu yo maro ta donge maga san le de nanyo samba le de marbe samba osa ta donge ne debi phumba la so ba ngo so ten ba jetan so de ba jete jetos o de donge jeto o de shidinge ngo so ten ba jetan so de ba jete je ya ores na larige sajin seben do de
Baso.
den so de ba se tan ja ko dule
Baso.
ko len de te ka do wa
Baso.
ta donge je bu do ne tonden de je donge ngon je bi ko so do ma so
Baso.
donge je bu de te je te me wa de ka ta wa de do mo mo lo wa de son yo res marba son jabate naga nyo na shedding ko so wa de te du yo res marba
Baso.
wa de son de sa marba
Baso.
yeah.
So we have the actual meditation on suffering as the head, so just going through the outline, and then we have reflection on the universal or the general suffering of cyclic existence, then reflection on the specific sufferings of cyclic existence. Then under the category of reflection on the general sufferings of cyclic existence, we have reflection on the 8 types of suffering, reflection on the 6 types of suffering, and reflection on the 3 types of suffering. And then the first category, which is the reflection on the 8 types of suffering, we find a quote from Nagarjuna, the friendly letter, or letter to a friend by Nagarjuna, where we find the presentation of the 8 types of suffering, but not done so in such an easy way, not done so in such an explicit way. Therefore, it's easier to look at the actual outline of the Lamrim Chenmo so that you can find all of those 8 that are being presented here in Nagarjuna's friendly letter. 4 explicitly and 4 by the words and so on, or indicated by words. So it says, Your Highness, be disenchanted with cyclic existence, which is the origin of many sufferings, being deprived of what you want, death, illness, old age, and so on. Here, cultivating a sense of disenchantment with cyclic existence means reflecting on it as the origin of many suffering. The 8 types of suffering include the 4 that Nagarjuna states explicitly, being deprived of what one wants and so forth, as well as the 4 that are indicated by words and so on. The Bhagavan taught these 8 in many discourses when he identified the truth of suffering. So where did Nagarjuna get this information from? He received this information from authentic sources, and those are the Sutra and Tantra teachings of Shakyamuni Buddha, the one thus gone, Bhagavan. So because he was able to find this enumeration of 8 in those texts, he presented them in the friendly letter, but did so in a way that was explicit and implicit. And it says here, indicated by the words and so on. So 4 were explicitly presented, which are deprived of what you want, death, illness, old age, and so on. And then the other 4 were implicitly meant by the words and so on. And so since they were indicated by words, they're not there. So then we need the outline of the Lamrim Chenmo to be able to refer to find out what those other 4 are. So it's quite easy to do so if we have that. And so Rinpoche didn't list the others, so he said we can refer to that outline if we want to look for what those are. Diksum. Oh, Dead School Rinpoche, Gongyal Mepache. So the reason that we do this reflection on suffering and the origin of suffering and the different divisions and so forth is so that we begin to have a disinterest. We begin to dislike suffering. We begin to not want it in our life. And therefore, because we have this idea that we don't want suffering, we slowly move towards the determination to be free, or towards the desire to definitely emerge from that suffering that we do not want. So this is what is meant. This is what the point of meditating on and reflecting on these sufferings and origins is. The point is. Dixon.
다들 데이터 토모유 메나 중앙 타지라양 네 토모와나네 총을가서 셰바나 내양 라와샤신스 단데이터 토모라리 양 공주래 총모도 토모라리 그냥도 공구레스 자지베텔 온비제 바다 템바스
Sachinipa.
온비제 바다 템바도데 제부 중도 어부 중으로 딘딘딘에 제부 침부터 침부로 왔다. 다 어부 제부 중을 그런 어부당 상비 내중 상와지 공부로 왔다. 내송도 되게라서 봐.
Lesso.
네 바본가 라랭고들 내송도 되게도서 저 못다바도 어디서 중을 가도록 어디서 송도 어디 랭고를 해도 어디래도 왔다. 중을 가서 중을 통을 나와서 그걸로 저번에 게 공부했어.
Lesso.
니도 통화 이메일.
Lesso.
원 chemin 공부, chemin도 통화 이메일. 어디 랭고 원비좀 봐서 어디 인사래.
So then this next section deals with the stages of this next section deals with the stages of the path that one must rely upon that are presented in the earlier teachings, even if one has advanced into another scope. So this becomes the second category of Jayan Sheba's outline. The first being the origin of the information, and then the need for the common practices or the common pathways. So it says, during every session in which you meditate on the teachings shared with persons of medium capacity, take up as well the shared teachings that I explained in the section on the practices appropriate to persons of small capacity. As for the teachings that are not shared with persons of small capacity, if your mind is strong, sustain them in meditation in exactly the way I've written them. If it is weak, then leave out scriptural citations and only meditate on the meaning of the points that I have outlined. Then, so we could the point of the common stages could stop at that. I explained in the section on the practices appropriate to persons of small capacity. So the point that's made stops there. And what that means is that if you are a practitioner of the medium stages, medium capacity stages of the path, that doesn't mean that you disregard the small capacity stagings of the path, because those are in common with the medium capacity and in common with great capacity. So we find a renunciation, for instance, in the pathways shared in common with beings of small capacity. That is a desire to definitely emerge or renounce the lower realms of cyclic existence. That desire to emerge from the lower realms is something found is in common with the medium scope and the great scope, because they have this desire to emerge from the lower realms. So here it says to take up the shared teachings. So that's the name of the category, to practice the shared pathways. And it's because these become part of the higher scopes themselves. They aren't something separate. They become a common practice that is within those scopes as well. So in Pabonka's commentary, we found the points that were once you have practiced karma and its results, and death and impermanence, discussed this idea of wanting to emerge from the lower realms of cyclic existence. Then you move on to these medium practices, which is emerged completely from cyclic existence, not just the lower realms, but one still holds that initial level of renunciation simultaneously, while simultaneously cultivating a higher form of it. That's it. Diksung.
What the Jimmy Chung the Tumu might be doing to Galo, Jimmy Chung the Tumu might be doing what the Marbe. Chung and Sung Sung the doing at the Matu, made doing at the light doing at Lama doing at to Santan and you some Gungu Marota, Jimmy Chung.
Less so.
What Chung the Tumu might be Marbe.
Less so.
Chung the Tumu might be doing at the maid doing it, light doing it, Lama doing it. What to go there, what to go, ne, Casore. Going to Samba Towers, you are. Louis to Tomo Maimbi, Junju Nala, Louis to Yenasa, Lucero del Nebaduna, Shero Shetu Duna, Cheta Tiba that is shitting Londramata, was in the Soma Najin,
Data in
Dunga Jill,
Lesso.
John Lasa. Shiro to what the Pachata Mabajano go through the Luna and Laris Sajil Sonja Ma Dina Sandan and Judas. What is one thing?
So then, after it says, as I explained in the section on the practices appropriate to persons of small capacity, as for the teachings that are not shared with persons of small capacity, so that is, for instance, in the pathways for beings of small capacity, or teachings for beings of small capacity, we have a desire to emerge from the lower realms of cyclic existence, hell, hungry ghost, and animal. But we don't have a desire to emerge from the higher realms of cyclic existence. We don't have the desire to emerge from the human, demigod, or God's realm. It's a goal to be born there. So this is an unshared practice. So that's what is meant by an unshared practice. As for the teachings that are not shared with persons of small capacity, if your mind is strong, sustain them in meditation exactly the way that I have written them here. If it is weak, then leave out the scriptural citations and only meditate on the meanings of the points that I have outlined. So if you are of a higher capacity of intelligence, then you should follow the practices and learn it in the way that it's been presented by using Nagarjuna's scripture and then being able to understand what's implicitly being stated there and be able to understand the meaning very easily or thoroughly easily. But if your mind isn't strong, and if just looking at these quotations are going to confuse you because of the omission, then it's better for someone who that confuses to just look at the outline and understand it in that way. So Lama Tsongkhapa is speaking to two capacities of persons. One that's able to understand it very easily in the way that it's presented, and then those who aren't as learned, who need just to look at the outline in order to understand it. So that's the point made in this second part of this stanza.
Tandunama Kasore, she dunga tru, dunga song, susu dunga, what is the Santane, and then I do samba gumba in, and I do samba chegun over his chegun. Gula chegun to you when you chegun over his.
That's so.
She yelled at the Bagumbatan, and you samba gumbatan, Shanchu Sangumbatan, chegun goes, Lani Woodwashere. Cheguns.
Yet they long yonder Surinam? Lamrim
Geshe Lharampa, Geshe Lharampa, Nanyu Samba Gumba, Shanchu San Gumba to so, Chegun Gogres, Jeremy Wolson Roa. What does Chegun is? Chegun Inaya, she want to go back to Gogres, Jajibo, the Chegun Inaya, she want to go back to good with the Sachi dig the water. Chegun. Dunga je tro son ane susu dunga samba tro watu so santan ne dunga nganju samba gongwa chegung res. Chegung yina ya shinwa to goba to tro gu res. What tangu yosa.
So the next section points out the importance of analytical meditation in relation to these types of suffering. So it's necessary to do analytical meditation on the 8 types of suffering, the 6 types of suffering, the 3 types of suffering, the specific sufferings of the individuals. So it is necessary to use this form of analysis. And when we look at meditation, there are 2 divisions: analytical meditation and single-pointed meditation, or focused or fixed meditation. So the analytical meditation that we're trying to develop here in relation to these topics has to be free from the obstacles of laxity, laxity and dullness, or sometimes translated lethargy. So it's confusing sometimes because those words are supposed to mean different things in the context of these obstacles to meditation. And when we have either laxity or lethargy, whichever is used, there's other forms under it within categories which are either laxity or lethargy. So you'll have to look into that and understand what specifically that word you're using for what word. I think that's the only way to do it. But they need to be free from these 2 obstacles of excitement and lethargy or laxity. And this is the kind of analytical meditation that has to be done. And we find later Lama Tsongkhapa pointing out that if one wants to have the emergence of faith in the spiritual teacher, or faith in the teacher, and one wants to develop a desire to emerge, and if one wishes to develop the mind that aspires to enlightenment, it's necessary to engage in analytical meditation to generate these realizations. So we find this analysis being indispensable when we're looking to have a realization, because we find it indispensable when we wish to have a realization, because that realization is dependent upon that analysis that is free from the obstacles of excitement and lethargy or laxity.
Gosu gasa, then goba su kagursa, shinwa to goba. Tanjanji about the shingo don't tell tango doos, Chigun inaya, shingo don't tell Google doos, tango doos. Shingo gosu gasa, I think about the shinwa to goba gaba, tango gosu ga. Tani Nimutan, Shin want to Matan was. Tani Mutan, neither Momba, and then she wants what the Lord Legua. Nimutans. Tani is not washing not to do as she lives in Sanju the Nimarbani. And then Nije was Nikusuna, Nikada, Gunguabrego Mara, Gungo Maratani, Mobasana, and then sends on down to Sanka Nato Dondachi, or the Maboba sounded to mobile mobile. She mutans. That she want to Matan, she wants. She want to go back, go back again to Gonja Kargumbaina, Nanu Samba Gumbaina, and then Nanu Samba Madajan Santan, Jen Santan Goba That maybe the Dunga Gumbaina, Dunga Gumba Sibumana.
Less so.
What is she want to say to some?
Less so.
Sibman say, and then the Tonton when Saint Dama Mana was she want Tamil to she want Tamu. What does she want?
The Dhamma Mena Sena? Got it.
Tagunja do what the Dungana Santama in the Dungan San Kubaje, sensible shit, strong your maybe your mother. What the dish in Holly was she want?
Then Tramo?
Thomas and what they Dungan Tonton the Imbala, Saint strong manner, she wanted was she want.
Oh, okay. So Though these are analytical meditations, you should nonetheless arrest excitement and so forth. So excitement and laxity is what this is referring to, and then all the categories in that. With regard to your mental object, not taking up any object, virtuous, non-virtuous, or ethically neutral, other than that you are meditating upon, without letting your mind fall under the influence of sleep, lethargy, or laxity. Meditate continually in a state of consciousness that is very clear and pure. Here one is taking up an object of observation for his or her meditation, and whether if it's a virtuous or a non-virtuous or neutral. Here, hold on one second. I just want to make sure I'm translating with regard to mental object, not taking anything other than. Okay. So when one has an object of observation. Okay, now I remember I have to do it this way. When one has an object of observation, such as suffering. So suffering becomes the object of observation of your meditation. So you're engaging in analysis of suffering in order to generate renunciation eventually, the desire to definitely emerge. So that meditation should not be under the influence of excitement, which means that you're supposed to be thinking solely about suffering and so forth, suffering and the points about suffering, but your mind is being distracted and moving on to objects of observation, and then here it says either virtuous, non-virtuous, or neutral, that are other than the object of observation that is intended. Once you waver or move to any other object of observation than the one you intend to focus on, excitement is present. And then the next type of non-virtue is laxity. And laxity refers to when the object of observation becomes unclear, where it's present but there's not a clarity around that object of observation. And then there's a very subtle form of laxity, which means that even though you might have some clarity in relation to your object of observation, there isn't a very strong ability to see, if you will, or apprehend that object of observation in its clearest, most uninhibited way. So that object of observation, even though you have clarity around it, it isn't a complete clarity. So that's a subtle form of laxity that can be present even if there isn't that more gross level present where there's that lack of clarity altogether. So that can be laxity too. So then Rinpoche went back to these things. Not letting your mind fall under the influence of sleep. So sleep is when you disengage completely, when you're in meditation and you fall asleep. So that's what the first category stands for. Next is lethargy. Lethargy is like a darkness that comes over, maybe right before sleeping. I'm trying to describe what that darkness is. So it's like as you begin to you begin to stop apprehending something like before sleep, and things become darker and darker. So that state of darkness is called lethargy. And then laxity is the term that we're using in this case for that lack of clarity around the object. It's called dullness a lot. You'll see that in a lot more text. Dullness and subtle dullness. But here we would say laxity and subtle laxity. But what it's referring to is this lack of clarity around your object of observation. Without this analysis that's free from these things of excitement and laxity, one will never be able to have the realization that he or she is trying to achieve. And in this case, in relation to the meditation on suffering, trying to generate renunciation. So one won't be able to if that analysis isn't pure, meaning an undistracted analysis. Digsun.
what the Casagore. The Jews and I, they was an unhard to some other. Deba. Jobasana, Tapananga to Dromanic, Dromanga, what the Chuga in the Euro. Chuga Jobas, I think, some other Joba. And then Chuga the Mandu and the heart on Hotel Deba. Penangu, so much and you know, Baina, could the Pajamojo Hotel, Jobas at the Debasana, what in heart on Eurota. Then the Chenrezig. No, then hard on Oman Pemodaya, what the Debatje, and the Jobas on the Pachatunda to the Dramak Pachandua, someone to be Pachandua, what to Kangalukua inside it.
The NGK Tambo, the Sikh Khandun Tambo.
What is
the Dunda Garre?
The Juba, the Juba said,
Juba, then a Khandun. They Ngadang.
Tan Deba said, they said,
Nipa.
Deba said, what the sound you Debas and a sound you hard on.
Okay.
Chenrezig Debas and the Chenrezig Uman Pemon hard on the Marba. Then I can double.
Then a Tambo, the Dandagare.
Debas and hard on the
Then a
Juba said the Pachanduat.
Bechet.
Canyon.
Okay. So here, where do we find that one needs to engage in this analysis with an undistracted mind? Where do we find this? So this distraction is a note, or is excitement or lethargy. So where do we find this point? We find it in Shantideva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, where it says there, it says, "For as engaging in the bodhisattva deeds says there will be little result from any virtuous practice if the mind is distracted." So here this is speaking of this analysis at this point in the text. A distracted analysis is not producing, even though it's a virtuous thing one is analyzing, not producing very much result. So it says, "The one who knows reality has said that prayers, austerities, and such, even if practiced for a long time, are pointless if done with a distracted mind." So if one's mind is distracted by these previously mentioned things, if one is doing prayers, so engaging in recitation of a prayer book or engaging in a recitation of prayers in themselves. Books, Rinpoche said books are prayers. Then this would fall under that category. So if one is distracted while doing that, then there isn't much benefit. It isn't as much benefit. Austerities is referring to if one is doing the practice of Guhya Samaja, for instance, reciting the mantra of Guhya Samaja. So that's a Guhya Samaja austerity. Or if it's a Tara, it's Tara austerity. The Rinpoche mentioned, I've forgotten the other deities, but Chenrezig austerity, if you're doing Omani Pemi Hom, or other deities, Yamantaka, Chakrasambhava, etc. Any of those practices while reciting mantras would be considered the austerities of those deities. So if one is distracted while doing that practice, then it won't be of as much value.
So at
the center we have our prayer book. When we recite that, then we're engaging in prayers. So then we have a section in the prayer book that has the mantras. When we're doing those mantras, we're doing the austerities.
And the same I was saying, be what the hard the person the Jebaina, the need bit dimensions, the need was Hajila Suba to Singer, the Sanji, the Shaja Tuvala Suba, to Sugu what the Shinguet not ten and go to what the Sukalo, to under Mabas over is, and Jeremy what the go. Debu Chuchuma to Marishi between this. And now she wanted to go back and train a go on Gumbaina. What did Goal Debu Dawayungo? Dawa Chuchuma to Marishi between this. The need between Messon she. He is yet to in be Gajutanjis, je de inbe inwa je de inbe geju tangje rebu chongwa songbe sheros rebu chong chuchong yin songbo res ne dewa jiye de jiro da dewa chiwe ma res den res da
Less so.
ya
So here, the one who knows reality is referring to Buddha Shakyamuni. So Buddha Shakyamuni has stated that if you engage in prayers, such as the prayer book, or mantric recitation, like we find in our prayer book, even if you do it for a very long time, it says, are pointless if done with a distracted mind. So the word pointless here in Tibetan is really not meaningful. So your practices will not be meaningful, even if they're done for a long time, if your mind is distracted by excitement and lethargy while you're doing your prayers and mantric recitation. So who has stated this? The one who knows reality. Lord Buddha has stated this. And then Lama Tsongkhapa says above it, there will be, so what does it mean that it's pointless? What is this not meaning? Will not have meaning. What does that mean? And what it means is that there will be little result from virtuous practice if the mind is distracted. So even if you're engaging in the familiarization of some kind of virtue, if your mind is distracted, you will have a very small amount of virtue accumulated because of that distraction. So that's the point about the downfalls of a distracted mind in relation to your analysis of objects of observation. Dixon.
ta
So
wodur ma geji cheba chebe deba gomba ozu khondang de re ta do nga so tarin deja na mara
the Tepa Chembi Gewa Shi Shinyan.
deba gomba sun yang do ji dang do wo de ne de ge gong yin na xin go dang zhe gui bu long ma wo dang do da xun ju ji wo cheba chebe deba gomba do ji do gong de wo dang de mara ba
So we find many quotes that show the importance of having an undistracted mind while engaging in analysis, while collecting virtue. We find it in the Sutra of Cultivating Faith in the Mahayana. We find it in the engaging in the Bodhisattva deeds. We find that in the text where it states that if one wishes to achieve faith in the spiritual friend, or a desire to emerge, or the mind that aspires to enlightenment, then an analysis becomes necessary for those realizations to occur. So we find all of these points made over and over again that show us the importance of trying to stabilize our mind.
oh yeah
And that's it. Thank you. So we'll do the concluding mandala offering and dedication prayer, and we'll end here. Tu Chenmo Rinpoche, the Sonchana Sheda Selbudu. The fundamental ground is scented with incense and strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, the four continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha land and offer it. May all sentient beings enjoy this pure realm. I dedicate whatever virtues I have collected for the benefit of the teachings and of all sentient beings, and in particular for the essential teachings of Venerable Lobsang Drapa to shine forever. I send forth this jeweled mandala to you, precious Guru. I dedicate all this virtue to emulate the knowledge of the hero Manjushri and likewise Samantabhadra as well, with whatever dedication is praised as supreme by all the conquerors who traverse the three times. I also dedicate all my roots of virtue for the sake of auspicious deeds. In that pure land surrounded by snowy mountains, you are the source of all benefit and happiness. All-powerful Avalokiteshvara Tenzin Yatso, may you stay until samsara's end. I pray for the long life of the precious Khensur Wandak, upholder of scriptural and realizational doctrines, the spiritual friend who trained extensively in the 5 great philosophical texts with exceptional wisdom and perseverance. Tu Rinpoche, Gusi Shapi Denrona.